Hi everyone, this is Jacob and it's finally Friday. Today I wanted to go over multi-user MIMO. And I know multi-user's been around for a while now, but with 802.11ax coming out, it's actually going to be back with a vengeance. So I wanted to go over what is multi-user MIMO and what is multi-user MIMO? Multi-user MIMO is simultaneous beamform transmissions to multiple stations in the downlink only. And that is what is going to change in 802.11ax, is actually going to be able to do uplink as well. And multi-user MIMO is a superset of spatial multiplexing and transmit beamforming. What I mean by that is you can actually use both spatial multiplexing and transmit beamforming within multi-user MIMO. So what is the difference between single-user MIMO and multi-user MIMO, which came in AC Wave 2? In single-user MIMO, we're only looking at a transmission to one device. However, it can take two different forms. One being spatial multiplexing, which is what I'm showing here on the left. That is, each radio sends different pieces of a transmission to the client. This increases the throughput of the transmission because you are moving a lot more data across. It also can take the form of transmit beamforming, which is shown here on the left. Transmit beamforming sends out the same information on all three spatial streams and lands them at the client using multipath. There's a lot of calculation that has to be done here in order to do this correctly, and it is overhead intensive, which we will get to a little later. Multi-user MIMO is different in that it sends out multiple transmissions to multiple different devices at the same time. So one of the big limitations of multi-user MIMO is the crazy math that these APs are having to do. The APs are having to send out a packet requesting the client to respond in order to send multi-user data where user 1's transmission does not adversely affect user 2's, which doesn't adversely affect user 3, which is an incredible feat for it to do. It's very hard. It's a lot of math that it has to crunch. And we'll see why that is a big limitation later on. So in order for multi-user MIMO to work, transmit beamforming is required. And this is what really causes a lot of the overhead in multi-user MIMO. The beamformer, in this case it's the AP, sends out a packet asking what the beamformees hear. And the beamformees have to respond back with explicit feedback. So this slide will break down what is actually going on. In Wave 1, single-user MIMO, so this is transmit beamforming, you have the AP will send out an announcement saying, hey, I'm going to send out a packet with nothing in it. I want you to respond back what you hear. So you have announcement packet, and then a inner frame space, which is the time waiting for the air to clear. Then it'll send out the null data packet, which has nothing in it. Then another inner frame space, which is a short inner frame space, and then the clients will start responding back with their information. So this creates a moderate channel overhead. It's doing this same process every 300 to 400 milliseconds. And the channel sounding process takes about 1 millisecond per client. So you can see that it's definitely some overhead to this process. The main thing we're trying to do is raise SNR, so your signal to noise ratio, because we're trying to land these transmission at the same time at the client, therefore making the copy stronger at the client. This brings out some questions. When would we use transmit beamforming? It's not exactly useful at short ranges because we already have good SNR because those signals are strong enough when the client is close. And long range, we really want the client to go ahead and roam to a better AP. We don't want to use something with overhead in order to keep that client attached to an AP that has a bad signal to noise ratio anyway. So transmit beamforming in reality is not very useful because the goal you're trying to accomplish is better accomplished by moving the client to a better AP. So with multi-user MIMO, a couple things change. It still sends out the announcement packet with short interframe spaces between the packets, and it still sends out the null data packet, which is once again, it has nothing but a header and some MAC information. There's not much in it. It's just asking the clients what does it hear. So the first client responds, and then it'll send out a report poll, and the second client will respond, and so on. It'll keep doing that until it goes through all the different clients. There's some significant changes here versus transmit beamforming. Transmit beamforming, we only did channel sounding once every 300 to 400 milliseconds. Multi-user MIMO, we actually do every 40 milliseconds, approximately. So you're talking about a lot more overhead. It's a very chatty technology. It is having to constantly sound and see where the devices are. And think about it as a strobe light. Transmit beamforming, it's only trying to land at one device, so it doesn't have to have a super idea of where the client is. So its strobe light is not going very fast. But the faster the strobe light's going, the more accurate we can tell exactly where that client is. So multi-user MIMO has to speed up that strobe light in order to know exactly where the clients are. So a lot of channel overhead there. So we're having to take up a lot of our airtime in order to accomplish multi-user MIMO. A couple other things is the beamforming has to respond after a short interframe space, which is 16 microseconds. So if you think of what these things have to do, the first beamformee has to get the null data packet and respond back within 16 microseconds, which is incredibly fast. And the compressed beamforming can be up to 1.5 kilobits large. So you're talking about a lot of crunching that has to be done very fast in order for this to work. And a lot of times it doesn't work perfectly. They're responding back with an imperfect picture, and a lot of times that can cause the process not to work. Once again, the channel sounding process takes about 1 millisecond per client, and the null data packet announcement and the report polls go out at the lowest basic rate. So we're once again causing a lot of channel overhead in order for multi-user MIMO to work. So ultimately, multi-user MIMO is a whole lot of ifs, and then at a certain point we just don't care anymore. So things like the RF environment must be supported. The frames must be queued up at the AP simultaneously. So the AP has to have these transmissions sitting in its queue for optimally positioned multi-user stations. So the stations have to be separated out by enough space in order to work. Of course, we know that the channel sounding overhead is very high. You're talking about 25 times a second when multi-user. So a lot of overhead. And on top of that, transmit beamforming is an optional Wi-Fi Alliance certification, and multi-user MIMO has no certification for the Wi-Fi Alliance. So we're running into a lot of problems here with not a whole lot to gain and very low odds of real-world success. In fact, I want to show you two of the newest iPhones. You have the iPhone 8 and the iPhone 10, and you can see that neither of them support multi-user MIMO. So if this is such a big deal, why is Apple not supporting it at all? And ultimately, it's because it's not. Apple knows it doesn't gain a whole lot, and in fact, it actually kills the battery of a lot of devices because they have to respond 25 times a second to multi-user channel sounding. So Apple decides not to even support it. So as a recap of the shortcomings of multi-user, you have no Wi-Fi Alliance certification, and it is optional for transmit beamforming. And it has to have both of those things. You have minimal client support for multi-user and transmit beamforming. You have multi-user groups that are almost always partially full. So if a multi-user group is not completely full, then you're losing a lot of your efficiency gain. Not all stations in the multi-user group will be at good MCS, so their data rates won't be good. And the transmission has to go out at the lowest common data rate. And lastly, multi-user sounding actually increases when the clients are moving around the environment. So we see a ton of channel overhead for very little efficiency gain. And this is why I argue that you turn off multi-user MIMO. So here we are on the Extreme Wireless Controller. And we're going to go into APs, and we're going to turn off multi-user MIMO. So in order to do that, we will click into an AP, hit configure. It'll be in the radio advanced settings. And you can see transmit beamforming. and it's set to multi-user MIMO, we can disable that. Hit close, hit apply, and now we've turned off multi-user MIMO. And therefore we've cleaned up a lot of our channel overhead and allowing our clients to do more of the talking instead of the chatty technology taking up so much airtime. That's it for this Filing Friday. Hope you have a great one, and I'll see you next time.